Hi, I'm Debbie Brown, and today I'm going to show you how to stitch chevrons using your walking foot on your home sewing machine. As with all of my tutorials this year, I'm stitching this on a small quilt, a crate quilt that will be donated to the animal shelter. It's a 14 by 20 inch quilt, and I've made mine using scrap 2.5 inch squares. The thread I'm using today is Fabulux from Wonderfil, and the color is called Cuddle. It's a pastel variegated, and it is lavender and mint green and light blue, and it's just going to make a very soft and subtle color on my quilt, especially since I'm stitching on gray fabric. I'm not using this thread in the bobbin though. I'm using a gray deco bob, which is also from Wonderfil. It's an 80 weight bobbin thread, so it's much thinner and I can get much more on a bobbin. Whenever you stitch chevrons on a quilt, be prepared to turn your quilt frequently. Every time you hit a corner, you have to turn your quilt 90 degrees. Now on this small quilt, this 14 by 20 inch quilt, it's not that much of a problem. But be prepared to manage the bulk of your quilt whenever you're turning a larger quilt to do chevrons. I've done this on very large quilts. It's a little bit of wrestling, but the end result is so worth it. My walking foot is on, my feed dogs are up, my machine is set to a stitch length of just less than 3 millimeters. I'm going to make my first knot off the edge of the quilt in the batting area. And by doing that, I'm just going to stitch a couple small stitches, and I'm ready to go. When I'm stitching a chevron, I have to decide if I'm going to stitch on every single square, or 2 squares, or 3 squares. Just how large is this chevron going to be? And I've decided today that I'm going to stitch this every 2 squares. So I'm going to stitch from where my needle is off the edge of the quilt here, down to the point of the second square. I'm going to visualize where that center line is and start stitching. Let me find my bands. I want to make sure I end right at the point. I also want to make sure that I get an extra stitch in that point. So on this machine, if I press my reverse button just once and hit my foot, it's going to take 1 stitch in place. Check on your machine to see how you can take an extra stitch. Now some of you might have tried this stitching aiming at a point, and so that's a great concept, but my line gets a little wiggly. Well, I'll tell you the truth, mine does too. So I have a couple tricks that might help you. The first one is I use 1/4 inch masking tape. So let me put some on here. And I'm not going to put this right down the middle of the line I want to stitch, because then I'd have to stitch through the tape. I'm going to put this next to the line where I want to stitch. So I'm sliding it under my foot here. Let me lift up my foot. I'll slide it under my foot, and I'm going to run it along the edge of those lines. Now if you notice, at the very end of my quilt, it doesn't go off as it doesn't stitch right off the end. And that's because there's a seam allowance. I've sewn a seam on the side, so it should be marking it about 1/4 inch in. Let's see if stitching this gets any easier. And I'll stop right at that point, hit my reverse button, and take another stitch. I've peeled off my tape and that line is nice and straight. I can continue repositioning this tape. It'll work about 5 or 6 times before it has too much lint on it to stick again. But it's going to give you just a nice guideline. And what's great about the tape is that if you stitch through it, it just will stitch through the tape and it'll peel right away anyway. So that's another way I do this. I can also go through and draw all the lines I want to stitch, but that's kind of time consuming for me. So I have another trick for you. My next trick is a laser marker. This is meant for hardware tools in the shop, but I've purchased it. I put a little command strip on it. I'm going to stick it right to my machine. The command strip to make sure it'll come off without leaving any residue on my machine. And you can see this is giving me a line, a straight line coming down from my needle. So what I can do is put my foot down, stitch to the point, take an extra stitch, and turn again. When I've finished with my first row of chevrons, I can stitch right off the edge because I'm going to bind over that area where I'm making the knot and use the scissors button on my machine to cut my thread. I can go back and I can make one in only the gray squares if I want to have them very far apart, or I can make one in every row of squares to make them a little closer, and I can even make them in between each row. So you get to decide how close you want your chevrons. For me, I'm going to make one in every square. So watch as I quilt. I've finished all of the chevrons across the entire quilt, and I'm tickled with the way it looks. Chevrons have quickly become one of my new favorite patterns to stitch on a quilt. I really love the movement that it gives. I can make them really deep. Being very, very large chevrons, I can make them close together or further apart, and I've even made uneven chevrons, which looks really, really fun. Take some time and make a crate quilt to practice, and then consider pulling out one of your UFOs intended for a charity quilt and practice on something larger. This isn't simply a pattern to use on giveaway quilts. This is a really great pattern to use intentionally on your quilts that just adds a lot of life and movement to them. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to make sure you don't miss any of my quilting tutorials. Visit DebbieBrownQuilts.com and sign up for my newsletter, where quilty goodness will be sent directly to your inbox. Also, products mentioned in today's video can be found there. Thanks for visiting.